I'm having the most perfect hallucination, cries a young man under the influence of LSD. Green and blue patterns are pouring all over me like a deck of cards. I have a feeling this is what Alice's paradise must be like. I don't feel I'll ever be the same again. Another man, lying on the sofa in a motionless state, spoke out under the influence of the drug and said, "All over the ceiling are geometric patterns of light. To say they are beautiful is a word too shallow to use." A Canadian girl under the influence of the drug said, "Next morning my arms were very long, long arms covered with beautiful feathers." Another man under LSD said all about me was nothingness, absolute empty space. I was floating on a solitary island in the ether. No part of my body was subject to gravitation. A teacher under the influence of LSD is reported as having said, it was love itself. It was Oriental women such as I have never known. Fat and languorous beyond belief, luscious beyond man's power of normal imagination. The report from another user of LSD is, after taking LSD, you can do anything better than you did before. You feel that something big physically has happened onto you. You feel violence in your system. The salesman taking LSD became convinced he was the Messiah. Another young man listening to a cello under the drug said, I became the cello and the cello strings and the music and the man who played the music. Another man under the influence of the drug said, I found I could make my room expand 1,000 miles, and I could also contract it right in front of me. My conscious mind was sort of sitting on my shoulder, watching everything I was doing. Still another man says, the one who goes out from this door and enters it again will never be the same man as the one that went out. A university student says, taking other drugs is like climbing a sand dune. Taking LSD is like scaling Mount Everest. And to the ones in the psychedelic world, it is called the aristocrat of the hallucinogens. A few days ago, a young man in Los Angeles walked in front of a speeding automobile. He thought he could do this and not be injured because he had taken LSD. And only a few days prior to this tragedy, in the state of New York, a young man stepped from the top of a 4th-story building thinking he could fly because he had taken LSD. A young lady committed to a mental institution thinking she was the Messiah and had come to end wars because she had taken LSD. These are just a few of the tragedies and the real examples and results of LSD, which one of our most esteemed senators said on the national broadcast the other evening, it presents a greater threat to our nation than the atomic bomb. So today the press, the magazines of the newsstand, the radio and television newscasts are all echoing the outcry of this new threat sweeping our nation, LSD, the mind drug. Many are asking, what is it? Well, it's the contracted name for lysergic acid diethylamide 25. In 1938, Dr. Albert Hofmann, a research chemist at Sandoz Laboratory in Basel, Switzerland, was trying to find a new stimulant for the nervous system. He was not aware of the fantastic effects of LSD until 5 years after his discovery. It was in 1943 that Dr. Hofmann began a self-experiment with 250 micrograms of LSD. He thought that small amount would be harmless. But in describing his sensation on that memorable occasion, Dr. Hofmann states, I felt at times as though I were outside of my body, and my ego or my self-conscious man seemed to be suspended in space. LSD is colorless, odorless, but it's very powerful. 1 ounce can treat 200,000 people. 2 pounds could treat everybody in the city of New York. One peddler of LSD had a small vial accidentally break in his suitcase, but it wasn't lost. He found long after his customers could have full treatment by simply sucking the cloth that had been exposed to the liquid spilled in his suitcase. In fact, today some soak handkerchiefs in the solution and cut it up in little squares. They provide these to the desired users of LSD who get their treatment or their trip by simply chewing these tiny squares of cloth. Another form of administration is to place a tiny bit of LSD on a sugar cube. It only takes about a 200,000th of an ounce to give a person a treatment. For many years, medical science has proven that the brain is electrochemical. The two simple chemicals of the human body, potassium and sodium, generate about 1/10 of a volt of electricity, which gives the brain its normal functioning power. Man has found that these electric impulses enter the sound department of the brain, giving hearing, and they enter the sight department of the brain, giving sight. But if man disrupts the normal function of the brain, either electrically or chemically, the electric impulse, which normally would enter the sight department of the brain, they may be diverted to the hearing or the sound department, causing weird and unusual noises. And by the same token, the electric impulses on the auditory nerves, which normally would reach the hearing department of the brain, these may be diverted chemically into the sight department and cause flashing lights of most amazing nature. One user of LSD tells of his attempt to try and drive home under the influence of the drug. He says, "The pavement in front of me opened up and it became flowing like Niagara Falls, and the streetlights expanded into fantastic globes of light, and they filled my entire vision." Friend, imagine if we have 50,000 deaths on the highway of America each year, what will be the death toll in the harvest of chaos? If our students begin to drive automobiles under the influence of LSD. One of the most tragic effects of LSD is the suicide tendencies. One of our most respected medical men, whose name I could quote, has devoted much of his life to the study of suicide. He stated last year alone he estimated more than 425,000 people attempted suicide. Where will this figure climb if thousands and thousands of our youth are now taking LSD? And one of the characteristics of this hallucinogen is the suicidal tendency that it generates. For example, one young person under LSD influence said, "I could have hung myself on the highest tree." Another said, "I experienced the desire to die, but not just physical death. I wanted to tear off my skin. I wanted to pull out my hair." You know, as I've traveled over the nation during these past months, I've collected a multitude of reports and testimonials, and almost from every city I have examples of these that are inclined towards suicide because of the influence of these hallucinogens like LSD. And there are the definite examples you may have read about. The young man in California who walked in front of a speeding automobile because under the influence of the drug he said the car could not hurt him. Or the young man that jumped out of a 4th-story window in New York and was picked off of the pavement, broken and bleeding. Why did he do it? He said he could fly under the influence of LSD. And apart from these, we know that barbiturate poisoning is one of the main means of suicide in today's Western world. One of America's most respected doctors, concentrating his study on a number of university students using LSD, made this statement. Many LSD users begin their experience with pleasant and good experiences, and then for some reason, these turn sharply into horror and into terror. Some of the students have told how sitting in the classroom long after their first taking of LSD, the faces of their fellow students suddenly became distorted and mask-like. They told of going to the cafeteria, and while looking at their plate of food, the food suddenly became a vortex swirling around them and threatening to engulf them. Still others told of simply going to the privacy of their own washroom to wash their hands, and the water in the basin suddenly became a pool of their own blood. One young lady tells of looking in the mirror, and her face became lined with scars and cobwebs and hideous to behold. It's no wonder one young girl was found walking on the street bearing a sign which read, "Please help me. I've taken LSD. In traveling this nation for the last number of weeks, I could relate illustrations like this from almost every city I have contacted. LSD is not habit-forming, but it has another quality that may be even more alarming. Long after the initial dose is taken, these hallucinations continue to reoccur, and reoccur so unexpectedly. No one thus far in the medical world has ventured to state or to predict how permanent may be the effects of LSD upon the brain of the mind. We may never have this answer until this generation has passed some of its agonized lives in the psychopathic wards and the mental institutions of our land. Everyone knows the greatest number of users of LSD is found among the college and the university students. No one knows exactly how many have taken this drug or are taking it, but we do know two things. The number is legion, and it's growing like everything every day. Today we have in America almost 6 million students in our colleges and universities. When we've asked for some to estimate the number of users of LSD, some have ventured to say the graduating class as many as 80%, and others say no, 10%. But one thing is certainly true, it's growing, and it's growing fast. During the past few years, there's been an increase in the varieties of products that have been offered to our young people in almost every street corner. Peddlers with total disregard for the health and the welfare of their customers, trying to line their pockets with easy money. Sellers of LSD have professed a profit as much as $3,000 a month selling the stuff. Even students tell of making $200 a week selling drugs to their fellow students. Marijuana is another great problem in our nation today, and we find that we could spend days discussing this with you as well, but we have only this tremendous group, beginning with the blue glue sniffing among the younger children, the blue heavens and the reds, the seconals, the amphetamines, the barbiturates, the marijuana, the mescaline, the peyote, and finally LSD, called the aristocrat of all of the hallucinogens. And you know, man's been conditioned for it. As one writer has so well stated, think of the millions of people who rely on tranquilizers to guide them through the frustrations of the day. Think of the millions of people who resort to energizers and pep pills. Think of those with sleeping tablets and the millions that resort to psychochemical called alcohol or whiskey. You know, seldom does any user of drugs remain content with the doses with which he begins. The reason LSD is having such a tremendous acceptance is because thousands of people have been conditioned by experimenting with the milder hallucinogens long before LSD became popularly known. Yes, LSD, I repeat, is referred to the aristocrat of hallucinogens, or the mind-expanding drugs, because it's 100 times stronger than some of the other drugs, even 700 times stronger than mescaline or peyote. The reason for the fantastic spread and the use of LSD is not only because its peddlers make a great profit. It's not only because the way has been paved in the lives of millions by the use of milder drugs and stimulants. There's still another reason, and don't you smile at me when I say television. The Federal Communications Commission has estimated that an average American spends approximately 3 hours per day in front of television. With a flip of the switch, he can transport himself into a world of make-believe, from the Arctic to the Orient, from the days of Julius Caesar and the Arabian Nights to the battlefields or the Pacific paradise. Our present world has become very frustrating and very dull to many people. Soaring taxes and 1,000 problems from Alabama to Vietnam. One well-known doctor says our children are looking for an instant paradise. And think of the young people today that have no other motto than live fast, look beautiful, be prepared to die young. The bomb may fall tomorrow. I'm sure that many students know there's danger in taking these drugs. One of our most widely read magazines carries the account of a 13-year-old boy who died from an overdose of drugs. Another article describes the gory scenes of 3 lads high on pills, shooting an elderly man and stomping him to death. One mother of the lads cried out, "My boy couldn't have done it unless he was on pills." Out of 20 university students examined by a well-known doctor, The report showed that 6 of the 20 had to drop out of school. One teacher was asked, if the students know that taking LSD might bring permanent brain damage, why do they take it? The reply the teacher gave was, well, if a student knows that tomorrow he may lose his head in Vietnam or by an atomic bomb, he's not too concerned about the possibility of damaging a few brain cells with a trip on LSD. You know, while some users may have lofty ambitions and hopes that the drug or LSD will bring them some miraculous transformation, make them poets and artists or supermen, there are many others looking strictly for escape. Escape from life that has become too painful for them to bear. What are we going to answer these young people today? The young people that are crying out, live fast, look beautiful, die young. The bomb may drop tomorrow. Friend, you and I must find an answer. And thank God we do have an answer. So we begin to develop this amazing picture of the battle for man's will, or synonymously speaking, the battle for the mind. Let's look at the mind for a moment just as its physical values, as a physical organ. It is perhaps without question the most miraculous thing in the natural world of the universe. As science and learning have developed in high places over the last 2 decades, man's wonderment has continually increased as to the phenomenon of his will or his brain. That little 3-pound, .3 substance of pinkish, grayish, jelly-like matter, encased in the 3 envelopes and the bones in your cranium, that operates on 1/10 of a volt of electricity, is an amazing substance. It is comprised of 13 billion brain cells. It has the storage capacity of storing within it during your lifespan 15 trillion facts. In other words, if you transformed everybody on earth to a fact, your brain could house the population of 5,000 worlds. Your brain is divided into 3 departments: the subconscious, the intermediate, and the recoverable memory. The subconscious part of your brain in itself is exceedingly amazing, almost to the point of being mysterious and strange. Without any dictation on your part, it carries on silently, continually, the electro-impulses of the electromuscular organ called the heart. Your old heart will beat today 103,389 times, drive the blood through your body over the labyrinth of veins and arteries, which in themselves represent 40 to 60 to 100,000 miles, depending on the size of your body. That means the blood will flow in your temple today a total distance of 168 million miles. All the way to the sun, 2/3 of the way back again. The blood flow in your body in one day, so the old heart keeps on beating because the subconscious brain never misses in its faithful duty. Your brain doesn't tire because it's not muscular. You can use your brain intensely and say, oh, I have brain fatigue. You cannot. It'll wear out your body. Your body will become weary, but your brain is not muscular. It's electrochemical. The subconscious, I say, is fantastic. It sends lightning-like messages out to your body over the brain nerves, the thinner ones being 1/25,000th of an inch in thickness, and over these the messages go to your closer organs at 2/3 of a mile per hour, but your larger brain nerves are 1/2500th of an inch in diameter, and over these the messages race to the farther extremities of your body at 300 miles an hour. You can wiggle your first toe and your first finger simultaneously, and the brain organizes this dispensing of knowledge. Fearfully and wonderfully made, says the psalmist in Psalm 139. Fearfully, wonderfully made. A few years ago, I picked up a copy of a nationally known magazine, and I read an article on LSD, the new mind drug. In this article, I was impressed with such statements as, LSD makes an end run around Christ. and go straight to the Holy Ghost. There is one basic experience that is expressed by almost every user of LSD drugs. It pertains to the ego or the self-conscious man leaving the body. As one man said, I was divided into two separate beings. One says, I became conscious of my eternal self. Another says, I went out of myself. Still another says, my spirit was released. And many, if not almost the entire majority, will say it is a spiritual experience. Now, I'm glad I don't have to depend only on the testimony of our modern users of drugs to enable us to understand the experience. The fantastic spread of the use of these mind-expanding drugs of today have caused some people to think it's relatively new, but this is not the case. The leading disciples and the advocates of the hallucinogens like to compare themselves today to the ancient Buddha or Krishna or Mohammed. But regardless of the contrasts or similarities that these may voice, we do know that man for thousands of years has resorted to whole galaxies of drugs taken from flowers or seeds or plants. And the effect upon the mind is what we call today psychedelic hallucinations. The Brahmins for thousands of years ago used soma, the drug that is taken from a creeping plant. For over 400 years, natives of Mexico have had the sacred visions by eating mushrooms called sacred mushrooms. The Aztecs call them the flesh of God. One writer says, the drug can induce religious experiences indistinguishable from the experiences that occur spontaneously in the spiritual world. You know, many users of LSD are rather reluctant to talk about their trip or their psychedelic experiences for one reason. They feel their experience belongs to another world, not to this place called Earth. Many users of hallucinogens declare very frankly that the vocabulary and the vernacular of everyday life on Earth is not adequate to describe their spiritual experiences derived from LSD. One man simply says this experience was spiritual. Why do you expect me to describe it in the language of Earth? Now, if the users of LSD consider their experiences to be spiritual, as so many do, and if the writers of the Bible refer to the Scriptures as the laws of the Spirit, it would be highly profitable and logical, it would seem, to compare what is being said today by the users of LSD to statements from the Bible, which is the law of the Spirit. One user of LSD declares that he was suddenly aware of being divided into two beings. His flesh or his earthly body was one part, and his ego or his self-conscious man was the other part, his spirit. Now, if we open the Bible to the book of Job, we read in chapter 32 and verse 8, there is a spirit in man. The Apostle Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, declares in 1 Corinthians 15:44, there is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. A well-known spokesman for the hallucinogens tells of his own experience under the influence of LSD and says, my spirit was released. And to his testimony we could add almost an endless list of others who speak of going out of themselves. Now, if you take the words of these modern users of LSD, declared that their spirit left their body, and you compare these to the experiences in the Bible, what do we find? We find an identical parallelism. The apostle writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in speaking of his own vision into paradise, he twice uses the expression in verses 2 and 3, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. One writing on his experience with LSD said, we assure ourselves that our destination will be heaven. But more often it turns to be hell. Another writer on LSD says, the temporary dying of the ego can be a hellish passage. No one described heaven and hell more vividly than Jesus. In Luke 16 we read, and the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. Speaking of heaven, Jesus says in John 14, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also." But in speaking of hell, Jesus said in Mark 9:44, "The worm dieth not, and the fire is never quenched." One user of LSD, whose story was carried in a very popular magazine, nationally known, said his experience was like going into Dante's Inferno, the steaming and the bubbling and the ghastly appearance. He said, "I saw hideous shapes in the distance. My mind floated to each one of these, and they were horrible and they were hideous, and they all got together in a mob, and they started to come after me." A prominent doctor who has studied the experiences of many students and users of LSD declares, "Many LSD users begin with extremely good experiences, and then, for some reason, they completely turn into horror and into terror. Even as one young man said, it all ended up in a creepy world, meeting frog-like men." You know, I pondered the words of that young man in his psychedelic hallucination. He said, I saw frog-like men. And I turned to the Bible, and I read in the last book in the Bible, where John the Beloved writes in Revelation chapter 16, verse 13, "I saw 3 unclean frogs," speaking of evil spirits, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. You know, thus far we have some rather remarkable parallels between the testimonies of the users of LSD and what men of the Bible have written. Those under the influence of LSD have spoken of becoming conscious of their eternal being, their spirit or their ego going out of the body, of feeling themselves in union with eternal beings, of having glimpses of heaven and hell. And the Bible contains the words of the followers of Christ and the writers of the Scripture that cover all of these things: the spirit that leaves the body, the visions of the heavenly world, the reality of heaven and hell. But we're forced to leave the testimonies of the users of LSD at this point, and from here on we're going to carry on only with the Bible for this reason. The users of LSD declare that you cannot know for sure whether your trip or your spirit leaving the body will be something good or bad, whether your destination will be heaven or hell. And even those that seem to start out well suddenly find the nightmare of terror and horror becomes literally a hell. But now listen to me. The Bible says you can know. The Bible says you can know that in the next world, when your spirit leaves your body, that your destination can be heaven or hell. The writers of the Bible do not flounder in this fog and the mist of uncertainty like some of our leaders in the psychedelic field. No, no. They agree in unity, in accord of faith and strength. Job writes, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." Paul writes, "I know in whom I have believed." John the Beloved writes, "Hereby do we know that we know." The Bible not only tells us that we can know there are 2 eternal destinations, heaven and hell, it tells us with clarity that we can know where we will exist eternally, in the place of the blessed or in the place of the doomed and the damned. Friend, in these days you need more than advice. With this satanic invasion from Legion, diabolic, you need Christ. You need the protection of His love and His blood and His Spirit and His Word with you in your daily walk. The Bible says, "Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus." Paul says we have the mind of Christ. When you submit your mind not to LSD or to drink or dope and all of these other pills of intoxicating nature, but if you realize the mind is your will and the doorway of your temple, and you yield it to God, know you not to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, His servants you are. When you yield to God, you're a bondservant, not by fear or force, but by love. Paul says, I'm a bondservant to Christ. As men have yielded to God like Knox and Moody and Finney and others, they've swept millions into the kingdom. And when men yield their minds to the devil, you have a Hitler, you have a Mussolini, you have raging maniacs to damn, to blight. All the forces of evil are there. You read in Jude verse 9, Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, disputed for the body of Moses. And that warfare goes on. Your body will expend $87 billion worth of chemical energy alone in its lifetime. You're fearfully, you're wonderfully made. God made you a temple for His Spirit to dwell in. Sin can bar you from God. Disobedience, pride, rebellion can separate your God. And Satan with his devils will take possession. That's God's word. Paul says in 2 Timothy 2, those that are taken captive by the devil at his will. So I plead with you on bended knee, for I'm speaking to you from my heart. Yield yourselves to God. Have the mind of Christ. Pray this prayer, Lord, give me the faith of a child to surrender now to Thee, recognizing that Jesus Christ died for my sin, shed His precious blood to cleanse my heart from sin. And when I ask you forgiveness, you do hear. When I invite you into my heart, I have your promise of John 1 and 12. As many as received Him, to them gave He power to become the sons of God, even to as many as believe in His name. And therefore, being justified by faith, I have peace with God. I have the mind of Christ, which is joy and peace in the Holy Ghost. But don't stop here. Remember, there are laws you must obey. The Apostle Paul says, with the mind I serve the law of God. In the Romans he says this, chapter 7, verse 25. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he said, so fight I, not blindly as one who beats the air. I keep under my body, I bring it into subjection, lest after having preached to others, I myself become a castaway. You must walk daily on the defensive. You must walk daily obeying rules. Paul says in Romans 12, I beseech of you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourselves a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And then Paul closes in Romans 8 by saying, who can separate us from the love of God? Can tribulation or distress or persecution and so on? There's no power in hell or earth can separate you from the love of God. No devil can invade your temple and occupy it as long as your mind is kept yielded to Jesus, cleansed by the precious blood of Christ, and the seal of God's Spirit upon you. Satan cannot destroy you. God says, unless you are born of His Spirit, you will not see nor enter the kingdom of heaven. But you can only be born of God's Spirit by bowing your will to Jesus, by surrendering your life to the Savior. And I ask you now that to protect yourself from the force of Satan, to protect yourself from a lost eternity where your soul will linger on for eons in damnation, bow your head right now and say, Lord Jesus, you died for my sin. And your spirit right now is ready to enter my life and bear witness with my spirit. I am spiritually born as God's child by the surrendering of my heart to Thee. And you have the promise of God's word. As many as received Him, Jesus, to them gave He power to become the sons of God, even to as many as believe on His name. God bless you.
Tommy Forrester is dead. Tommy was going to be an engineer. He was 22, good-looking, personable, athletic. He had a high IQ. The dean said he had the best potential of any man in his class. But Tommy is dead. His problem was acid, lysergic acid formula 25, called LSD. A close friend told him LSD was psychedelic, mind-expanding. said it would give him fantastic new sensations and thrills. So Tommy tried it, and his friend was right. At first, the LSD made him sick at his stomach, but then Tommy began to hallucinate. The air began to be filled with rainbows. The very atmosphere seemed to be a moving current of multicolored particles which came streaming down around him. When he listened to the stereo, he saw colored particles floating out from the speakers. When he looked at the walls, they seemed to be melting. The pictures on the walls became liquefied with colors running down like waterfalls. It was sensational. Inside himself, Tommy felt sublimated, sort of suspended in space. He had a euphoric feeling of wonderful well-being. Then he looked in a mirror, and something horrible happened. First, it seemed that half of his face was rotting away. Then he began to see himself as a grotesque, misshapen monster. He looked around the room, and all the people were becoming monsters. Everybody knew what was happening to Tommy because he began screaming and describing what he was seeing. Tommy had the feeling he wanted to smash his head against the wall to bring himself out of this stupor. He did it. Blood spurted from his nose, and a large cut bloodied his forehead. But he felt no pain. Then he pounded his head on a doorpost. Somebody in the room tried to stop him. He felt they were his enemies, so he jerked away. He ran into the next room where an open window looked out on a roof across the street. It was 18 stories to the ground. Tommy thought to himself that the roof across the street was really just a few inches away. He could jump on it and thereby escape. He tried it. Tommy is dead. Not everyone who tries LSD for the first time gets such a violent reaction. One authority estimates that among first-time users, about 1 out of 20 will go into a traumatic nightmare such as Tommy's. As for the other 19, their reactions are unpredictable, but will range all across the emotional spectrum. For some, it will be a scintillating and exhilarating ecstasy. For others, it will be repose, even stupefying. The cult of LSD users call any of these psychedelic experiences good trips if they don't end up out of control. But they never know when a bad trip will hit them. Just about the time a user begins boasting that he has become a real acid head and suffered no real ill effects, a bad trip can sweep him into emotional oblivion. A bad trip can send him wandering down the highway seeking to merge himself with some speeding automobile. It can send him into epileptic fits, make him schizophrenic, or permanently impair his sanity. It may rob him of the will to live and terminate in suicide. Others lose a sense of identity and cannot tell where the boundaries of their own bodies separate them from their environment. With some, there is a feeling of deep despondency and an accompanying fear that it is wrong for them to go on existing. Even on so-called good trips, the acid user often becomes a serious hazard to himself. His whole sense of reality becomes distorted. He thinks he can fly like a bird or walk on water. He can look at a crack in the sidewalk and shrink back as though it were a Grand Canyon. Or he can look down from the top of a skyscraper and have the feeling it is barely inches to the ground. Scientists suspect that the LSD has its greatest impact on that part of the brain which decodes and interprets sensory impulses. By paralyzing or scrambling these sensory signals, the patterns in the brain become flamboyant, twisted, unreal. Sometimes the user thinks he can smell or taste the sound of music, or, as was the case with Tommy, he thinks he can see the music. The capacity of the brain to associate the present with the past is impaired. Perfectly familiar objects may seem completely foreign or non-identifiable. At the same time, the most bizarre associations seem to cloud the conscious mind, so that a user can be looking at a person and suddenly gain the impression that that person is dissolving away or turning into some kind of a strange monster. As with all psychedelic compounds, LSD not only diminishes the instinct of self-protection and self-preservation, but it removes the natural inhibitions. A professor of a Philadelphia university came out of his LSD spree to discover that he had been running naked and bleeding up and down the boulevard on which he lived. A prominent official of the government was found naked and freezing in the topmost branches of a backyard tree. From the point of view of the police, the problem of psychedelic drugs is not only what it can do to the user, but what a temporarily demented user often does to other people. During January of this year, 4 teenagers on a binge of LSD rammed into a house, killing a 3-year-old child. The police found the driver of the car to be in a psychedelic trance. After placing him in a jail cell, this teenager tried to climb the wall, shouting, "I'm a graham cracker. See, my arm just crumbled off." A woman in California who prided herself in being able to take LSD without any ill effects took a knife and slashed out the eyes of her child. A 30-year-old medical student who was recently apprehended for murder admitted that he had been under hallucination drugs for several days. His dazed brain was puzzled by the presence of police officers. He looked at them and said, "What have I done? Raped someone?" He had actually killed his own mother. All I have said so far about LSD is really an introduction to this recently developed acid cult compound. Nevertheless, I hope it will help you appreciate why some doctors have referred to this as one of the instant insanity drugs. LSD was not developed in the United States. It was discovered in 1938 by Dr. Albert Hofmann of the Sandoz Chemical Laboratories in Switzerland. Dr. Hofmann was doing special research with a purple fungus often found attacking rye plants. This fungus contained lysergic acid, which Dr. Hofmann was processing in a variety of ways to see if he could find something to tone up the nervous system. One of the formulas he compounded was designated as number 25. It was not until 5 years later that Dr. Hofmann discovered that his formula 25 was a psychedelic drug. While working with it, he accidentally inhaled some of the fumes. Within a short time, he began to hallucinate. He wrote that for 2 hours he had fantastic visions of extraordinary vividness, accompanied by a kaleidoscopic display of intense coloration. This formula was immediately patented by the Sandoz Corporation, which thereby became the only legal outlet for LSD-25 in all the world. In 1949, Max Rinkel of the Massachusetts Mental Health Center introduced this drug into the United States for experimental purposes. Small doses were administered in carefully supervised situations to see if a sense of well-being or euphoria could be artificially transmitted to alcoholics and certain types of mental cases. However, it soon became apparent that LSD-25 was a highly dangerous drug. Its side effects were totally unpredictable. When used on borderline mental cases, the LSD would sometimes send patients into a prolonged psychosis requiring extended confinement in a mental institution. A pattern of suicidal tendency also appeared among patients, and others suffered from severe schizophrenia or split personalities. As Dr. Duke Fisher of the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute has written, quote, "It is possible to have recurrent LSD experiences without using the drug again. We have encountered many people who have given up LSD only to find that as much as 2 years later, they are having paranoid feelings and hallucinations without taking LSD again," unquote. Over 2,000 medical reports were written on the various aspects of LSD-25, and there was so much adverse publicity concerning it that the Sandoz laboratories took it off the market. However, it was known that this compound was not difficult to produce, so it was not long before the formula developed by Dr. Hofmann was being clandestinely passed along the corridors of certain university chemistry labs. It also began to come into the country from bootleg sources in Europe. Of course, a normal dose of LSD is so potent and microscopically small that it is easily concealed. Because it is colorless as well as tasteless and odorless, it is extremely difficult to detect, especially in a liquid solution. In a single ounce, there are approximately 280,000 doses. This means at the going rate of $5 per dose, an ounce of LSD-25 would be worth approximately $1,400,000. In liquid form, LSD has appeared in small ampoules right on up to large bottles labeled mouthwash. Sometimes it may be found in crystalline form and packaged in capsules, or it may come as bulk powder and in the form of tablets. The latter are usually dissolved in a sweet liquid or in water and ingested, or the liquid may be soaked into a cube of sugar, an animal cracker, or a candy wafer. It has even been found in chewing gum and the gummed flaps of envelopes. A common cigarette can conceal $50,000 worth of LSD, or 10,000 doses. By 1963, significant quantities of LSD were being bootlegged on certain university campuses. Its promoters described it as a genuine thrill potion, something real groovy. In fact, it was in 1963 that two professors were discharged from Harvard University for the alleged promotion of LSD among students. They were Mr. Timothy Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert. For several years, Dr. Leary had been experimenting with exotic mushrooms from Mexico, and when LSD came along, he boasted of becoming a regular user of it. He subsequently involved Dr. Alpert, and they were both discharged after it was allegedly determined that they had involved a considerable number of students in an institutionalized acid cult. After their discharge, Dr. Leary and Dr. Alpert set up an outfit called the International Federation for Internal Freedom. For a while, they operated in Mexico, but they attracted so much undesirable attention, the Mexican government became alarmed and asked them to leave. They thereupon returned to New York, where Dr. Leary procured a 64-room mansion in Millbrook, New York, which resembled a Bavarian castle. There they set up a cultist colony called the Castalia Foundation. In December 1965, Dr. Leary was arrested at Laredo, Texas for the illegal transportation of marijuana from Mexico to the United States. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. However, the wheels of judicial appeal grind slowly, so Dr. Timothy Leary has remained at large on bond and has been enjoying unprecedented success in promoting his formula for a psychedelic adventure in acid ecstasy. In October 1966, a federal statute went into effect making it a federal crime to manufacture or possess LSD and certain other prohibited drugs. However, the Supreme Court then ruled that the use of peyote as a psychedelic drug in the religious ceremonies of certain Indian tribes is a constitutional right which cannot be denied them. As one might have expected, Dr. Leary soon organized his own tribal religion, using LSD, peyote, and marijuana as part of the sacramental ritual. He called his new religion the League of Spiritual Discovery. According to an article in the New York Times of September 20th, 1966, Dr. Leary was demanding that the courts treat him at least as well as the Indians and allow his followers to legally consume these so-called sacred drugs of LSD, peyote, and marijuana in the private shrines of their own homes. Dr. Leary states that the goal of his new religion is to turn on, tune in, and drop out. That's a quote. He describes dropout as meaning, quote, to detach yourself harmoniously, tenderly, and gracefully from world commitments until your entire life is dedicated to worship and search, unquote. Medical authorities point out that what an acid user really does is to degenerate gradually into a mental vegetable, without ambition, without goals, and without the will to struggle. Gradually, the user withdraws more and more from social contact as the inner core of his entire personality seems to wither away. Among young people, Dr. Leary continually pushes LSD as an esoteric stimulant. He says, quote, an LSD session that doesn't involve an ultimate merging with a person of the opposite sex isn't really complete. One of the great purposes of an LSD session is sexual union, unquote. Of course, Dr. Leary knows that this acid compound is actually a sex depressant. But why should a super salesman of his national stature be concerned with such minor details? To protect himself, he always suggests that if young people don't happen to receive the promised endowment of esoteric stimulation from LSD, it may be due to the fact that they were distracted by all the rainbows and vivid colorations during the hallucination period. All authorities agree that strange mentalities like Timothy Leary and other advocates of acid ingestion are having an amazing success in converting more and more teenagers to try psychedelic drugs. Among students on a number of university campuses and sometimes even in high schools or junior high schools, taking a psychedelic trip has escalated into a status symbol. The health officer at the University of California, who is a physician, estimates that 1 of every 4 students on that campus has experimented with psychedelic drugs in one form or other. 4 high school students in New York went on a psychedelic binge, and one of the girls describes her experience. She says, quote, "I was looking at my friend Linda. Suddenly feathers popped out on her skin. Her nose curved into a beak. She had an eagle's face. I looked at my boyfriend Johnny. He was turning into a bird too. So was Linda's boyfriend. We were in Central Park Zoo. I couldn't move. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come. Oh God, I heard myself yell. People really are animals. I started laughing hysterically, only inside I didn't feel funny. I started to run away from the others through Central Park until I stopped under a stone bridge. Johnny kept calling me. After a long time, I went up on the bridge. Johnny always had been my source of security. He said LSD was groovy and wouldn't hurt me. He said I'd see beautiful colors and hear musical notes, but I never did. Instead, I saw awful things. People looked like monkeys. Cracks in sidewalks became deep crevices you could fall into. Finally, after about 8 hours, the drug started to wear off. I was depressed for days afterwards. I never want to try that again," unquote. Actually, this girl was lucky. She came out of it. In a 3-month survey by the Los Angeles County General Hospital, it was found that 66% of the LSD patients brought into the clinic after a bad trip had to be classified as extended psychosis patients, meaning that they required immediate commitment to a state mental institution for prolonged treatment. One of the most recent discoveries of the respected geneticist Dr. Maimon M. Cohen is the fact that LSD not only damages the brain of the user, but it affects the human chromosomes, thereby leading to mental retardation and physical abnormalities in the offspring of LSD users. It has also been recently revealed that ever since 1955, the United States military service has been looking upon LSD as a chemical warfare bullet. They have pointed out that a single ounce of this concoction properly distributed can mentally unbalance approximately 300,000 people for a significant period of time. A few pounds of LSD dumped into the water supply of a major city would be enough to neutralize and disorient millions. This is why it has been looked upon as a chemical warfare weapon. Some 10 years ago, LSD was experimentally administered to certain military personnel without their knowledge. It was found that these troops soon ceased to function as a military force. Their discipline disintegrated into complete confusion. They were unable to respond to the most simple commands, and they could not perform the most routine tasks with any acceptable degree of accuracy. As an enemy sabotage weapon, here is the effect which it could have on a city, according to Dr. Sidney Cohen, Chief Psychosomatic Officer of Medicine at the Los Angeles Veterans Hospital. He describes it in his book entitled The Beyond Within, and writes, quote, "The city exposed to a successful LSD attack presumably will cease to function. The inhabitants will be so bemused with the odd things that are happening to them and their neighbors that for half a day an aggressor force could take over without substantial resistance. A saboteur could carry enough in an overcoat pocket to produce serious temporary effects on all of the inhabitants of a megalopolis such as Los Angeles or New York, if only he could distribute it evenly. The contents of a two-seater piece of luggage will hold amounts sufficient to disable every person in the United States, unquote. The ease with which this brain-muddling chemical could be delivered to a whole population is contained in a recent report from Los Angeles which says, quote, not only could it be distributed through the water supply, but it may be suspended in the air, and the inhalation is equally effective as a casualty producer, unquote. At the present time, however, America's chemical warfare attack is not by enemies from abroad, but by enemies within. The Los Angeles Police Department reports that interviews with several thousand drug users clearly demonstrates that both young people and adults tend to follow a definite pattern of evolution as they commence with routine thrill pills and then progress gradually into heavy addiction with opiate narcotics. The Los Angeles report indicates that after individuals have more or less fooled around with the abuse of medical drugs, they tend to develop a curiosity to experiment with something a little more daring. Once again, it is not a professional pusher who usually gets a person to try something new, but the closest associates and friends. This next step is nearly always in the direction of the hallucination drugs. The most popular ones at the moment are LSD and marijuana. We have already discussed the effects of the more powerful LSD, so let us look briefly at marijuana. Marijuana is one of the oldest psychedelic plants in the world. It originated in China, but was later cultivated in India and became known as Indian hemp. The plant has a male and female species. The narcotic resin is particularly abundant in the female plant. Marijuana is processed by taking the flowering tops and leaves of both the male and female plants and then drying them by indirect heat. After the seeds and stems are removed, the dry fibers tend to crumble and resemble catnip or tea, hence the nickname for marijuana. Although there are several ways of using marijuana, the most popular method in the United States is smoking it. The marijuana cigarette is shorter and thinner than the commercial variety, and the ends are crimped and tucked in to prevent the contents from spilling out. Because these cigarettes pass through many hands as they are sold and traded back and forth, they are usually wrapped in double tissues of white or brown cigarette paper so as to stand the wear and tear. The effect produced by marijuana is that of excitement, sometimes hallucinations. However, increased indulgence will produce drowsiness and unconsciousness, so it is technically classified as a sedative. The pupil of the eye of the marijuana smoker becomes extremely dilated, and the white portion of the eye becomes bloodshot. In this condition, the pupil of the eye will not react normally to light, and the user will squint or completely close his eyes as though he were looking at the headlights of an approaching car. This is why the marijuana smoker often resorts to dark glasses and wears them even at night. This does not suggest, however, that everybody who happens to be wearing dark glasses is suffering from the toxic effect of marijuana. As with LSD, marijuana impairs time and depth perception. A curb may look like a deep canyon or cliff, but when the user is standing on a real cliff, he will swear that the bottom of the canyon is only a step away. Marijuana also destroys the normal inhibitions of the user, resulting in sexual promiscuity or criminal acts of violence. This has been cited as one of the reasons why so many of the most vicious sex crimes are perpetrated by marijuana users. Crimes of robbery, burglary, and homicide are also common in these cases, and the police found that individuals are usually under the influence of marijuana when a person tries his first injection of heroin. Marijuana exaggerates whatever mood a person may be in. It gives him a delusion of greatness, strength, and influence. He conceives of himself as a talented artist or an enchanting lover. He may also appear to be content or easygoing, even hysterically laughing, but he can immediately fly into a violent rage at the slightest provocation. Because of this unpredictable effect of behavior, police officers consider a person under the influence of marijuana to be dangerous. Continuous use of this drug will deteriorate the brain tissues, bring about a complete state of insanity in some cases, which requires permanent confinement to a mental institution. Here are the more obvious and readily apparent symptoms of a person under the influence of marijuana. First, visible muscular tremors. Second, accelerated pulse and heartbeat. Third, reckless and erratic operation of an automobile. 4, dizziness resulting in an irregular walk and an unsteady stride. 5, irrational behavior such as reckless and brazen disregard toward other people. Now, the Los Angeles Police Report indicates that when a youth or adult has become somewhat accustomed to experimenting with LSD and marijuana, there is a very likely possibility that he will try the heavy opiates. This brings him to a disastrous crisis of total drug addiction. Here is the way an 18-year-old boy named Jan from New York City evolved into heavy narcotics. He says, quote, "This will sound crazy, but after LSD I felt I didn't exist anymore. I was nothing. I shouldn't be alive. I had no feeling of who I was. That so depressed me I started on junk, heroin. Then I didn't feel anything," unquote. Jan became a hardened addict and soon found that he was committing serious crimes to get the money for his craving of narcotics. Heroin is probably the worst of all the alkaloids that can be manufactured from opium. It is completely impractical for medical purposes. Its manufacture has been outlawed. Heroin has all the bad features of other addictive drugs, plus the fact that it is many times stronger. It is also extremely expensive. Heroin addicts frequently reach the stage where $50 to $75 per day are required to get enough heroin just to feel normal. The cells of the body not only crave the narcotic to feed upon, but they threaten to go into convulsions if the narcotic is delayed or withheld. This is called the withdrawal symptoms, which absolutely terrifies the drug addict. It is this fear of withdrawal as much as the craving for the drug which drives an addict to commit crimes and get the money needed to buy more dope. Here is what withdrawal is like. As the body cells begin signaling for a fix, the addict commences yawning, accompanied by profuse sweating and running of the nose and eyes. There is marked dilation of the pupils of the eye, and severe hot flashes begin surging through the system, followed by an attack of cold chills. The muscles begin to twitch. This is a sign that the system is getting ready to go into withdrawal pains. It is this stage which terrifies the addict. The whole body commences to go into violent cramps. Addicts describe the excruciating pain as shooting from the roots of their hair down to their toenails. There is continuous nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Life becomes a torturous nightmare and sleep is impossible. Addicts have been known to remain awake for weeks at a time, resting only in a coma. The pain is so severe during the first several days of withdrawal that the addict will throw himself to the floor, double up in convulsive cramps, and scream for relief. Unless one has seen a confirmed addict pass through this torturous experience, it is almost impossible to comprehend. One would imagine that this would permanently cure a person who has been subject to addiction. Unfortunately, it does not. The vast majority of those who have once been hooked on anything as strong as heroin will go back to it eventually, even after they are supposed to be cured. This is the real tragedy of the so-called hippies and the 13 to 15-year-old teeny boppers. They think they are just enjoying a temporary binge of drugs, sex, and psychedelic hallucinations, when they are actually launching into a pattern which, if continued, is guaranteed to turn them from healthy and wholesome human beings into half-mad creatures of a nightmare existence. When I see some of these young people in the prime of life with their straggly hair, dirty clothes, and sleazy gait, herding together like a cult of uncivilized cave dwellers, I cannot help but wonder what will happen to them further down the trail. I have seen enough of them to know what life can do to them. They may be hippies today, but tomorrow they are junkies, half-educated, broken in health, alumni of a dozen jails, objects of charity, just human derelicts. Many of them think that after their binge they will get rid of their heroin, hallucinations, etc., and get on with life, but it is not that easy. Many of them that think they are just on a temporary binge are more hooked than they really know. Here is a note from a former hippie which has been preserved by Bill Helper of the Long Beach Police Department. The note said, "King Heroin is my shepherd, I shall always want. He maketh me to lie down in the gutters. He leadeth me beside troubled waters. He destroyeth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of wickedness for the effort's sake. Yea, I shall walk through the valley of poverty and will fear all evil. For thou, heroine, art with me. Thy needle and capsule try to comfort me. Thou strippest the table of groceries in the presence of my family. Thou robbest my head of reason. My cup of sorrow runneth over. Surely heroin addiction shall stalk me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the damned forever. On the back of this note, the author had added a postscript. Here's what it said. Truly this is my psalm. I am a young woman, 20 years of age, but for the past year and a half, I have been wandering down the nightmare alley of the junkies. I want to quit taking dope, and I try, but I can't. Jail didn't cure me, nor did hospitalization help me for long. The doctor told my family it would have been better and indeed kinder if the person who first got me hooked on dope had taken a gun and blown my brains out. I wish to God she had. Unquote. Well, such is the end of the hippie trail. And thousands of our young people are on that trail today. I like to think we can do something about it. I like to think the young people themselves will want to do something about it. The big job is really education. We have to somehow get the story to them in time. Preaching won't do it, but teaching might. I have faith in our young people. I'm raising 8 of them myself. Somehow I feel that if we really try, if we really concentrate on this whole narcotics fad, we can get our youth to see the futility of it and the stupidity of it. In conclusion, therefore, may I offer several possible solutions. First, may I suggest that it needs to be recognized and emphasized that the current narcotics fad is very much like a forest fire. It is self-expanding, with each inflamed goofballer, psychedelic, and hippie trying to inflame and involve his friends. And like a forest fire, it is self-destroying, leaving in its wake the ugly, burned out, and disfigured fragments of what used to be promising human beings. Secondly, it is time to recognize that this forest fire of narcotic contagion can and should be contained. A bare majority of the President's Crime Commission wanted to remove the stigma of crime from narcotics and treat it like malaria or smallpox. In other words, treat it merely as a medical problem. However, a substantial minority of the Commission, the ones who seem to have the most professional experience and competence in dealing with the problem, strongly disagreed. They said the medical aspects of the problem are remedial or therapeutic, but not preventive. They said the promoters and participants in the narcotic cults are conspiratorial and are waging a war against decent and orderly society. Therefore, those responsible need to be identified and penalized rather than cuddled and coddled, they said. Laws needed to be stiffened, they said, not softened. Enforcement, particularly by the courts, needed to be far more vigorous, decisive, and prompt. Furthermore, they said new laws needed to be passed facilitating the procedure for the collecting of evidence and convicting of the guilty. We once had such a procedure, but the Supreme Court, with several of its members strongly dissenting, threw it out. The Congress then passed a new law which was hailed as a fair and restrained approach to the problem, but the President, for some reason, elected to veto it. At the moment, therefore, the legal containment of narcotics is deplorably weak, and the minority members of the President's Crime Commission have discovered a serious prevention gap in the narcotics front, which I feel needs immediate repair. Third, there needs to be a widespread educational program designed to give narcotics a cultural taboo. The laws I just mentioned are needed primarily to contain the small rebel element, which prides itself in creating chaos in our society. But the majority of the people will respond to an educational and cultural approach. Fourth, if we are to develop an effective program of education on narcotics, it must be initiated and maintained on the institutional level where the attitudes and cultural values of our youth are being formed. Initially, this is in the home, but ultimately, it is in the school. As a rule, the elementary and secondary schools have done a fairly effective job, but a devastating breakdown has occurred on the college and university level. Both parents who pay the taxes and students who have come for an education deserve a better climate of order and common sense than has existed on so many campuses, where riots, pornography, narcotics, and venal sexuality have been allowed to develop into an established pattern of campus life. I believe parents and students both deserve something better than that. Fifth, it needs to be recognized that the creation of fads in human behavior is exactly like the creation of fads in dresses and bathing suits. People like to be in on the latest thing. Therefore, whatever the newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV start booming as the latest, grooviest thing is going to catch on. What I'm trying to say here is that the mass communications media could perform a tremendous public service by developing a code of ethics which says they will not give expensive page space and airtime to stories which will obviously promote a fascinating interest in human depravity and narcotic debauchery. What I'm asking for is not censorship, but an emphasis on honest reality. It makes a tremendous impact on a young mind if narcotics are presented as the latest, grooviest thing, something the smart set is all doing. It would be just as easy to portray the goofballer, acid head, and pot smoker as an archaic form of stupidity which modern civilization has repudiated as completely as human sacrifices. And finally, let me say just a word about the home. This is always the favorite scapegoat to blame for most of our problems. But the fact remains that the home is indeed the key to a civilization's survival. Therefore, we turn to the home in hoping it will help meet the escalating problem of narcotics. Here are several things for parents to remember. First of all, young people who are practicing a consistent participation in genuine religious activity, not the God is dead cult, but genuine religious activity, will hardly ever fall for the lure of narcotics. All of our studies prove this. Secondly, young people who have a wholesome group of associates around them with a cultural taboo against narcotics have no difficulty avoiding the current fad. Third, young people and even adults who do get involved in the psychedelic or addiction fad are usually those who are bored with life, who don't have enough challenge, who don't have enough responsibility or enough opportunity to be creatively involved in life. Here are some of the things every home can take decisive action in doing something about right now. Furthermore, young people, also adults who find themselves bored and neutralized toward life, I believe have a responsibility to get with it and not wait for somebody else to coddle, cajole, or cudgel them into becoming happy, creative human beings. So, my message is not one of despair. There is plenty all of us can do about this current problem of psychedelics, hallucinations, and addiction. Certainly the challenge is sufficiently acute to demand the best from each of us.